Hi everyone. My name is Harrison Schmitt. I'm currently in my first year as an assistant professor in the psychology department at Skidmore College in upstate New York. And I actually just finished my PhD at the University of Arizona back in May, where I worked with Dr. Daniel Sullivan. And so the work that I'll be talking about today is sort of the culmination of my dissertation research from the past 5 years on slow violence in the Southwest. And so the work that I'll be talking about today is sort of focused in on a specific environmental justice issue that occurred in Southside Tucson. And so Tucson is, just for some context, a mid-sized city located in the southwestern United States. It's sort of nestled in between several mountain ranges in southern Arizona. And so given that this is kind of where I'll be focusing on today for my discussion, I'm hoping that you'll all kind of humor me for a minute and do a little bit of role playing to get this discussion started. And so imagine for a moment that the year is 1960. You're a 12-year-old, and after living in a rented mobile home for the first 12 years of your life, your parents are finally able to save up enough money to purchase their first home in Southside Tucson. You're excited because you finally get to live in a neighborhood with lots of other children, and you kind of revel in those slow summer days where you spend most of the day at the community pool or running through your neighbor's sprinklers. You continue attending middle and high school in the area now that you live here, and you discover during this time that you have a passion for teaching. So after graduating from high school, you attend the University of Arizona to become a teacher. After earning your bachelor's degree in elementary education, you decide to return to the South Side to give back to the community that raised you. You purchase your first home, it's walking distance from the school that you now teach at, and you feel content that you're able to return to this community as a teacher. However, periodically you start to hear whispers and rumors that people you went to high school with are falling ill. There's strange cancers, heart conditions, neurological problems, things that you thought only older people would experience. After years of hearing about these illnesses in your community, you decide that you don't want to live with this uncertainty anymore without doing anything about it. So you begin to compile a list of the people in your neighborhood that have fallen ill. Then suddenly, a local newspaper publishes a breaking news story. It's alarming, but unsurprising. And what you find out is that your community has been served contaminated drinking water for many decades. And now suddenly you feel the immense kind of stress and uncertainty that comes along with this kind of discovery. You start asking yourself, am I going to get sick? Are my kids going to get sick? And not only are you concerned with these kind of health concerns and uncertainties in the present, but suddenly you feel your entire past being reinterpreted in the light of this new discovery, the shadow of this contamination. All that time that you spent at the community pool, running through sprinklers, was that water contaminated? Have I exposed my kids now in the same way, right? Would this have happened to a different, maybe whiter, maybe wealthier part of town? And so now you find yourself at this kind of crossroads, right? You ask yourself, how do I want to respond to this contamination? How do we as a community want to respond to this contamination? And so the story that I just sort of had us role play through is actually a true story of a woman named Melinda Bernal, who grew up in Southside Tucson and in this way discovered that her community was exposed to contaminated drinking water. This story was collected by my colleague Denise Moreno Ramirez as part of the Voices Unheard project, sort of oral history of environmental injustice in Arizona. And now Melinda's story is a sort of prototypical experience of living on what are called Superfund sites in the United States. This here is a map of all of these sites across the US. And these are essentially areas of land that have been heavily contaminated and that are currently being monitored and sort of remediated by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, today I'll be focusing specifically on the Superfund site that is located in Southside Tucson, Arizona. This is called the Tucson International Airport Area Superfund Site, or TIAA, where the community was served contaminated drinking water for the better part of 3 decades. And now, of course, this kind of exposure that occurs on Superfund sites is a really common environmental justice or environmental racism issue. And the concept of environmental justice basically describes the sort of bleak reality that communities of color and low-income communities in the United States, but also globally, are disproportionately victimized by a wide range of environmental hazards. And these Superfund sites are, of course, really common examples of this. Now, in the field of psychology, when we think about the mental health impacts of environmental catastrophe, we often think about the more visible and acute kinds of stressors that are associated with things like natural disasters. However, the kind of chronic and slow-scale exposures to contamination that occur on Superfund sites look really different from that acute stress that occurs following a natural disaster. And in fact, Rob Nixon calls these kinds of exposures slow violence, or that which occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And now, in spite of the kind of invisibility and slow nature of these kinds of exposures that occur on Superfund sites, we know that these kinds of structural violence are still associated with mental health outcomes like post-traumatic stress. And so in a recent meta-analysis, my colleagues and I found that people living on Superfund sites tend to have significantly higher rates of depression, stress, anxiety, and also post-traumatic stress. And this is due to a variety of things like the experience of health impacts from exposures, but also a sort of loss in our sort of naive sense of safety in our environment and the disruption of social bonds as people can't trust each other anymore, or as family and friends die off from the kinds of health impacts from these exposures. And so given this idea of slow violence and this kind of event of chronic contamination that's occurred in Southside Tucson, I want to talk about some research that my colleagues and I have conducted over the past 5 years on the mental health impacts in this area. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some theoretical and methodological considerations that have kind of inspired this work. And so 3 specific kind of recent-ish formulations in social and cultural psychology have specifically inspired this work. And so these include field social psychology from folks like Power and Velez, but also critical historical psychology from Daniel Sullivan, and then also various kinds of critical and participatory action research approaches. And basically from these formulations, I think it's really important that we understand that in order to kind of paint a thorough picture of shifting sociopolitical contexts, like the embattled space of an environmental justice community, we have to interrogate not just individual psychological processes, but we also have to try to understand how these processes play out in cultural and ecological contexts, and also how these processes unfold over historical time. So this means that we have to engage with the kind of messy interplay between psychology, history, and social structure in our work. And so we have to move away from the kind of purely positivistic epistemology that characterizes hegemonic psychology and move toward more pluralistic epistemologies. And then finally, we have to move beyond simply doing research on communities that have been exposed to environmental justice issues and move toward doing work with communities, doing research with communities through these kind of participatory action approaches. And so given this kind of theoretical background, the goals of the work that I want to talk about today are to richly describe, accompany, and intervene on the experience of post-traumatic stress in the context of environmental injustice as it has unfolded over historical time and in cultural and ecological context. And so this really necessitates the use of mixed and multiple methods. So I'll talk about a variety of qualitative and quantitative data, as well as some archival and participatory approaches that we've used. And so I'll begin with some historical context on this kind of exposure in Southside Tucson. And so in order to do this, I want to first situate us in space in Tucson. So this here is a map of the major metropolitan area in Tucson. And so this circle is basically Midtown Tucson. This is where I lived when I lived in Tucson for the past 5 years. It's also where the University of Arizona is located. This is a sort of brief snapshot of some important demographics in this area. It's approximately 38% people of color, 23% Hispanic or Latinx. Just 8% of the people in this area have less than a high school education. And also the per capita annual income in this area is about $26,000. If we look just a few miles south in Southside Tucson, we see that the demographics look very different. This area that's circled below is comprised of 93% people of color, 86% Hispanic or Latinx. Fully 38% have less than a high school education. And the per capita annual income is $10,000 less than just a few miles north. And of course, this red area is the boundaries of the Superfund site. This is the contaminated groundwater plume where the community was served contaminated drinking water for several decades. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is a pretty classic kind of example of an environmental justice issue. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge why this and how this groundwater came to be contaminated. And this comes from a variety of sources that are found on the south side. So Southside Tucson is basically surrounded by 4 parties that are responsible for having contaminated the groundwater. These include the Air Force Base, a major Air National Guard base, an international airport, and a weapons and missile manufacturing plant called Raytheon, which was at the time called Hughes Aircraft. And these 4 industrial sort of players were irresponsible in the way that they handled various kinds of toxic chemicals, and these leached into the groundwater and were served to something like 50,000 people. And now to situate us in sort of historical time as well, the community was actively being contaminated and being served contaminated drinking water between approximately 1952 and 1983. And then in 1983, it was declared a Superfund site, and they stopped serving this water to the community. And now often when I talk to psychologists about this work, I get questions like, why are you still studying this issue if this community has been served clean water for 40 years now? But what I hope we can talk about today is the way that the psychological and social and human costs of contamination sort of linger on long after the kind of material progress has been made. And so just to give us an idea of some of the social processes that have occurred, we know that between 1986 and 2006, a variety of lawsuits were brought against the polluting parties, with tens of millions of dollars being paid out to some of the victims of these exposures. But then unfortunately, we also know that in 2004 and in 2009, new contaminants of concern, or what we call emerging contaminants, were discovered on the site. So the community had to learn about a variety of new chemicals that they had also been exposed to, and to learn about the kind of health impacts that might be associated with those things. And now, given this brief kind of overview of the history of events in the community, I also want to highlight the kind of research that I'll be talking about today. So I'll be talking about some archival studies that were conducted in the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. And then I'll also be talking about some studies that my colleagues and I conducted over the past 5 years. So we can try to understand how this community has experienced this exposure over time, back in the 90s, 30 years ago, and in a more contemporary context. And now something that I think is really important for us to understand in the community's kind of experience of this exposure is that the Superfund site in Southside Tucson is sort of lauded as a success story, actually, according to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And so we often see this coming through in community meetings with presentations like what you see on the screen here. So these are maps that the Tucson Water Department often presents to the community. And basically what they're trying to show is that there's been immense material and technological progress that has been made on this Superfund site. And so we see on the left, the original contaminated groundwater plume in 1987, before they started remediating it. And then we see it 30 years later in 2017. We can see that most of the contamination has been cleaned up from the groundwater. And I want to acknowledge that this is amazing progress. This is an amazing feat of technology and of the government doing something good, right? Coming together and cleaning up this mess. But what this often ignores, this kind of official narrative of progress, is that it ignores the human cost, right? The people who are still living in the wake of this contamination, who are still experiencing uncertainty and health impacts and so on. And now to move to a more general kind of discussion of the environmental psychology literature on the mental health impacts of exposure to environmental catastrophe. Most research in this area has been conducted in the context of natural disasters, as I mentioned. And so often what we see in these kinds of exposures to natural disaster, like for instance, a tornado, we see the initial exposure that's very acute and visible and traumatic. This leads to immediate distress for communities that are exposed. But then we see this kind of linear path towards recovery. And so this often happens in about 1 to 2 years, according to the literature, where people are acutely stressed at first, but symptoms wane off after about 1 to 2 years. Importantly, this kind of idea of a linear path toward recovery mirrors that official narrative of progress that we see on the Superfund site in Southside Tucson, right? That we have cleaned up the site, right? So things are getting better. But I want to argue that the psychological experience for communities exposed to slow violence is quite different from this linear progress toward recovery. And so it might typically look something like this. We might have a community who's initially exposed to some kind of contamination, and then this exposure leads to distress. But then rather than having this progress immediately towards recovery, we see these kind of cycles of stress and traumatization and re-traumatization occurring. And so, for instance, once communities are exposed, they experience a lot of uncertainty. These exposures are often very invisible. It's hard to see. It's hard to know how much you've been exposed or if you've even been exposed. And this uncertainty contributes to all kinds of social conflicts. So people might disagree about how much they've been exposed or what they should do about it. And then this uncertainty also leads people in positions of power to ignore and delegitimize community concerns. And then we also see that the ecological contexts in which people find themselves are full of constant reminders of that initial distress of discovering that you were exposed to contamination, right? Every time I let my kids run through the sprinklers, every time I turn the faucet on, I'm thinking, is it still contaminated? Is it safe to drink? And then, of course, these slow scale exposures often contribute to more slow forming kinds of health issues, things like autoimmune diseases or cancer that might not appear until 10, 15, 20 years later. And then finally, as we've seen specifically in Tucson, we often see talk of emerging contaminants, right? You might discover new contaminants as our technology gets better to detect different kinds of toxins and so on. Communities often discover new contaminants that they didn't know about originally when they were exposed. And so all of these things contribute to these kinds of cycles of stress and re-traumatization. And so that linear path toward recovery becomes much more tenuous at best. And now I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that these individual and social processes of cyclical re-traumatization are not occurring in a vacuum. They're also occurring in a broader context, right? And we can accurately describe that context as racial capitalism, right? This is the concept that capitalism does not just exploit the working class, but it also exploits through culturally and socially constructed differences such as race and ethnicity. And so through this framing and understanding that these individual psychological processes are occurring in this broader cultural context, we know that these communities are not just facing the stress of contamination, right? But this is a largely low income and Latinx community that's already facing the stress of discrimination and other forms of exploitation inherent to racial capitalism. And through this framing, it's important for us to acknowledge that environmental injustice is not an aberration, it's not a deviation, but it is actually the normal functioning of racial capitalism that kind of describes the reality of these communities even before they've been exposed to contamination. And so given this kind of summary of the literature, I think it's important just to acknowledge a few aspects before we move into the empirical portion of our discussion today. So first, I think the literature suggests that exposure to slow violence can result in post-traumatic stress, and it may be maintained long-term by these cycles of re-traumatization. But also, there are local institutions and cultural contexts that are advancing different kinds of narratives, right? This narrative of linear progress towards remediation of the contamination, but also towards psychological recovery. And this may be at odds with the community's stress experience. And then also these things are happening in this broader kind of social context of racial capitalism. And so now I want to talk about the research that my colleagues and I have conducted over the past 5 years. And as I mentioned, I'm really passionate about using these kinds of mixed methods and these critical participatory action kinds of methodologies in this context. And so I struggled a bit with deciding how to present this research, but what I settled on is the following. I want to talk about four different sort of pieces of the data that we've looked at over the years. And these include both historical and contemporary studies, as I've mentioned, but also qualitative and quantitative studies. So we have both qualitative and quantitative studies that are archival, right? Conducted in the past, conducted in the 1990s. And then we also have contemporary qualitative and quantitative data. And rather than talk about each of these sort of piecemeal, I want to pull some major themes from this work that cuts across all four pieces of data so that we can think about what we can kind of glean from this mixed methods and sort of cross-time sort of methodology. And so just to give you a little bit of information on each of these four pieces of data before we talk about what we found. First, we can think about the archival interviews that were conducted more historically between 1998 and 2002. So these were 32 interviews that were conducted by Dr. Raquel Rubio Goldsmith and her students. And basically, they interviewed 32 Southside Tucson activists and local experts about their experience of working with and responding to contamination. And then similarly, we conducted 13 interviews with Southside Tucson activists in the present. So these were conducted in 2019. And we actually interviewed some of the same people that were interviewed in these archival interviews. So we can think a little bit about how the community's experience has changed or not changed, about 20, 25 years apart. And then in terms of the quantitative data, there were two surveys that were conducted, one by a government agency back in 1996, and then one by my colleagues and I this past year. And so I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the quantitative data here. So in terms of the historical survey, the historical quantitative data, the government agency ATSDR conducted a door-to-door survey in 1994 of 700 residents. And so they were able to find 350 people who had been exposed to contamination and 350 people who had not been exposed to contamination. And just for the context of this talk, I'll focus on three questions that they asked. So they asked a yes/no question about whether or not people had experienced psychological distress in connection with environmental contamination. They asked about people's perceived risks to their health from exposure to contamination in their neighborhoods. And then they also asked people whether or not they'd been diagnosed with cancer. And in terms of our contemporary quantitative data, as part of my dissertation research, I collected a door-to-door survey of Tucson residents this past year. And so we collected a total of 363 participants, 153 who had been exposed to historic contamination, and 210 who had not been exposed to contamination. And we measured a variety of items that are somewhat similar, at least conceptually, to what was measured by ATSDR back in the 90s. So we measured post-traumatic stress, risk perception, so people's perceived risks to their health from contamination in their neighborhoods. We also measured self-report health concerns. So we included cancer, but also things like birth defects and autoimmune diseases, which we now know are connected to the kinds of contaminants of concern in Southside Tucson. And then finally, we measured some things that we thought might help people to cope with the stress of contamination. So these things included social support, but also perceived neighborhood social cohesion. So how much do you get along with your neighbors and so on? Okay, now what I want to do is move to the first kind of theme that we've kind of identified over time, looking at these historical and contemporary pieces of data. And so the first theme we can call re-traumatization. And here we want to really describe the lived experience of the kind of cyclical re-traumatization that we think might be happening in the context of slow violence for folks in Southside Tucson. And so looking first to the historical interviews, we see two major factors that might be contributing to re-traumatization for this community. And I'll read a few quotes here that kind of reveal these sort of themes. And so one Southside Tucson activist said, "I have seen sickness and dying, and it continues till this day. I mean, we know it in our families. We have cancers. The people that have the cancers, to me, it's like the living dead. They have to go through so much pain and stress. Their way of life is completely changed. And so we see that one major potential source of stress for these folks is the material impacts of contamination, right? Cancer and death and dying and so on. The second quote reveals perhaps the other major source of stress. So this activist said the following: "They shut the wells down, but there is no way of turning back the contamination that we were exposed to. They shut the wells down and they forgot the people. They didn't even want to talk to the people, and today we are just considered as historical. But as long as I'm alive, I'm not historical. As long as the people on the South Side continue to struggle, it is not historical, it is living, ongoing right now." And so I think this demonstrates the kind of social stressors that might contribute to these cycles of stress and re-traumatization, right? Not only are we sick and dying from this contamination, but we're also being ignored, right? We're being sort of erased from the social space in the community. And so if these are the sources of stress that people are talking about 20, 25 years ago, it's important for us to look at what sources of stress people are talking about in our contemporary interviews. And actually, we see the same exact things coming up in people's responses in our current day interviews. And so, for instance, one activist said the following: when you get talking to people and this person died, that person died, this person died, when's it going to be my time? So those same kind of material impacts might still be a source of stress. And then secondly, we see the same kinds of social processes also potentially contributing to those cycles. So another activist said the following: "We shouldn't be looked at as if we could have children die in our homes and we're not going to be somehow traumatized by these things. We're traumatized. Our stories of how and what we've gone through are just no big deal. Who cares? When we're being ignored, it's wrong. We just go from generation to generation to generation with the same issues." So here we see that delegitimization of community concerns, right? People in positions of power are ignoring and delegitimizing community concerns. So again, we're seeing those same sources of stress contributing to this re-traumatization for this community 25 years apart. Now let's look to the quantitative data. So looking first at the survey conducted back in the 90s by ATSTR, we see that the exposed community in the green bars scored significantly higher or had significantly higher frequency of psychological distress, risk perceptions, and rates of cancer than the non-exposed community in the gray bars. So essentially, Southside Tucson is suffering from these issues 30 years ago. And now we can ask, what about today? What about the survey that we just conducted this past year? Here we see on the left, this graph represents post-traumatic stress as the outcome, and on the right, those risk perceptions. And again, we see the same exact patterns happening here. The exposed community is experiencing higher rates of post-traumatic stress, specifically in connection to environmental contamination, than the non-exposed community, and they're also experiencing higher health risk perceptions in their community. Now, what about physical health impacts? Again, we measured various kinds of cancer, but also autoimmune diseases and birth defects. And of course, these are self-report, so there's definitely possibility for inflation or over-reporting or inaccurate reporting. But still, what we see here is significantly higher rates of self-reported cancer, autoimmune diseases, and birth defects, all of which we know to be connected with the contaminants of concern in Southside Tucson. And now, as a sort of exploratory mediation analysis, my colleagues and I looked at whether or not these heightened risk perceptions and heightened health impacts, including cancer, autoimmune diseases, and birth defects, might be driving that higher post-traumatic stress among people exposed to contamination in Southside Tucson. And indeed, we find evidence for significant mediation by risk perceptions and health impacts. So those kind of cancers and autoimmune diseases and so on, but also the perceived risks of those things might be driving this ongoing post-traumatic stress for this community. And so here we're painting a sort of bleak picture, right? That the community is experiencing these stressors 30 years ago. They're experiencing the same exact things today. So it seems like not a lot has changed, or at least the cycles have continued. And so our second theme that I think is also really important for us to consider in this context is how the community has coped with and fought back against the issues of contamination over time. And so I want to actually show a brief video of an interview with Melinda Bernal, whose story I told at the beginning of this talk. And here she talks a bit about how she and the community have coped with the stress of contamination.
when I saw the paper and I just saw it and I said, this is it. This is, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I said, this has to be it. This is what's happened to all of us and to all of our family members and friends that are ill. And so from there, we started organizing. And Eduardo, we started a group, but before that, a few of us got together and said, what can we do? And we scheduled the Valencia Library to hold a meeting. And we put the word out that we would be meeting to talk about all the illnesses in the community and, what had caused them perhaps, and that we were going to start a group to try to get to the bottom of it and see what we could do. So, there was a neighborhood group, the Sunnyside Neighborhood Association. We notified them. We tried to notify any, the teachers union. There were people there. I went there initially representing them. And we tried to get, as many people notified as possible, because you'd be surprised. Nobody knew anything that they thought, oh, people are sick. Well, they just thought, their mother died at 40, of breast cancer. I mean, that's not normal. I mean, it really isn't. And even in those days, and, they just thought, well, as some of them told us, that's God's will. And no, we're not going to be organizing for anything, and we just kept at it. We just kept contacting people. And so we had this first meeting, and I believe it's on tape somewhere. On one of the tapes I have, there's a little piece of it I know that you'll see. We just started meeting, and we had this big meeting at Valencia Library, and Eduardo came, and he was there, and Lynn Prouty was a teacher at Sunnyside High School. She came. My sister came. She was an elementary teacher, and a lot of members of the association came, and I could name them all, but it wouldn't do any good. But Eduardo and I kind of took over the meeting. We just had called it, and he had caught wind, I think, of it, or I had caught wind of a flyer he put out. I don't really remember now which way it was, but however it was, we had this joint meeting, and from there, we began organizing around the problem. And we kept notifying people and calling people and, surveying the neighborhood. We'd walk up and down streets and ask if people in their family had any kind of illnesses, their kids, any illnesses. And because we didn't realize then, but we realize now that those who were exposed younger were the ones who had the most problems. They got the most illnesses. So someone like me, I was fortunate that I moved to the neighborhood and at junior high level, and I've had many problems throughout my life, lots of illnesses, lots of things that normally all of them wouldn't happen maybe to one person, but fortunately they've not been deadly yet. And I know that that's eventually, it'll probably be the case. But we knew that something was wrong and that we had to make a difference for the community. So we just, from that meeting, we set a new date, and we just kept spreading the word to local community organizations, to other groups who had noticed in the past, and that's where some of the, Myrna, I think her name was, and the person who
So we can see a variety of things happening, I think, in this interview, which I forgot to mention was an interview conducted by Denise Moreno Ramirez as part of that Voices Unheard project I mentioned earlier. And we can see both the kinds of sources of stress and re-traumatization, right? All those health impacts that we're seeing. But we're also seeing how the community is able to respond to and fight back and build grassroots organizations in a context where they've been abandoned by their representatives and by institutions and by people in positions of power. And so that kind of coping through community connection, coping through collective action seems to be a really prominent factor in these oral histories, right? In the archival interviews that we saw from the 90s as well. And so given that this happened in the past, right, that the community got together and organized and so on, all the way back in the 80s and 90s, as Melinda Bernal is talking about here, we can also ask what's happening in the contemporary moment, right, in these contemporary interviews. And so one activist that we interviewed in 2019 said the following. So in order for us to get things done, it seems like the only answer we have is to gather in groups and demand. And so that's what this other group that's recently formed, it's called Las Aguas. That's what that group is doing now. And I've joined that group, and I'm active with that group. But it also pisses me off that I have to do that I still have to do that. It's been so many years, and we still have to come together and force our voices to get heard still. That's the part that annoys me. It's not that I'm doing it, and I'm not doing it for me anymore. I'm doing it because I have nieces and nephews and a younger generation that we really need to leave a better planet to. And so we see that still over time, the community is still having to reform these these groups, right, rebuild these kind of coalitions and so on in order to demand that their voices are heard. So we're still coping through connection in this way and through collective action, but we're getting tired of it, right? These cycles of trauma and re-traumatization and building grassroots organizations and so on, they're still happening, which is great. But we're also really annoyed that these things are still having to happen. And so what do we see in the quantitative data? So I just want to highlight one finding from our contemporary survey, right, that we collected in this past year. We do see that the community stress experience is sort of buffered by two forms of connection, right? So like I mentioned, we measured social support and also neighborhood social cohesion. What we see in the gray bars or the gray lines, there's actually no association between social support and post-traumatic stress for people that were not exposed to contamination. But we see a significant negative effect of social support on post-traumatic stress for people that were exposed to contamination. And so essentially, the extent to which people are getting social support, are seeing their neighborhood as connected or working together with their neighbors, these people are experiencing less of that post-traumatic stress, less of those cycles of re-traumatization potentially. And so I think this points to a really important sort of avenue for future research and advocacy and action. If we can contribute to building these and maintaining these networks of social support, we might be able to at least combat the psychological stress that's been experienced by these communities in these cycles over time. And so as one last piece here for our discussion of the kind of empirical portion, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of participatory methods and approaches that we've used. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that lots of work in kind of community-based research has been sort of extractive, right? It's been a sort of almost colonial model of doing research where these white, wealthy outsider researchers come into a community, do research on the community, and leave so they can get their publications and move on to bigger and better things. I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that that has historically and even contemporaneously been the case for this kind of research. And so we need to do what we can to combat that kind of extractive nature of this research relationship. And so one of the many ways that we can do that is by using participatory action research methods and approaches and principles. And so some of the things we can do is report the results back to the community to ensure that they know and hear about the research that's been conducted in their community. But also to involve them in the broader research process. So not just coming in, doing the research and giving them the results, but also asking them, what questions do you want asked? What questions do you want research to address in your community? And how can we involve you in that process? And so I just want to highlight a few of the things that we've done to kind of involve these sort of principles in our research throughout the past 5 years. And so first, we've had a lot of community input on our methods. So we didn't just come into the community, randomly start interviewing people, randomly start doing a door-to-door survey, right? But instead, the first few years of doing this research actually just looked like relationship building, right? Showing up to community meetings, building relationships, building trust with community members, and then asking and finding out what things they want research to be conducted on, right? How can we rebuild trust between the community and researchers and between the community and local institutions? And what kinds of questions do we want answers to? And then secondly, of course, given that this is a largely Latinx, largely immigrant and Mexican-American community in Southside Tucson, we made sure to have all of our materials translated in both English and Spanish. And then finally, we reported our results back to the community, again, both in English and Spanish, with sort of community-friendly kinds of language to present these kind of complex research processes. And we didn't just give these to the community, right, but we've hosted meetings where we meet with the community to discuss these results and what they mean. And then finally, we're not just reporting the results to the community, but we're also reporting them to local and national institutions and officials, right? So if one of the major sources of stress and re-traumatization for this community is the fact that local institutions aren't believing and are re-traumatizing communities, then it follows that we should talk to these local institutions and officials about our research, to let them know that they've been doing that and to try to help them to stop contributing to those cycles of re-traumatization. And so in line with this, one of the major things that we've done is we worked on a online open access community stress resource center with ATSDR. That's that government agency. And this is basically to help educate public health professionals about the psychological stress experience of living on a Superfund site so that we can work to kind of combat those cycles of re-traumatization. And so in conclusion, I just want to highlight that this kind of experience of post-traumatic stress in the context of slow violence might not follow that linear path toward recovery, but instead we need to think about these kind of cycles of stress and re-traumatization. And we need to use these different kinds of methods, right? Over time, qualitative and quantitative, archival and participatory, and so on, to really understand these kinds of impacts. But also I think it's really important to note that even though local institutions have kind of put forward this official narrative of progress towards remediation and recovery, the Southside community has really combated this kind of narrative. And I think it's really important that we sort of highlight how the community has combated that. Also, there are some things that I think we as potentially critical environmental psychologists can and should be doing given this kind of research. I first and foremost think it's important that more environmental psychologists think about and engage with contemporary environmental injustices. Secondly, I think it's also really important that we accompany environmental justice communities, both in terms of their psychological distress, but also in terms of the political struggles that they engage in to address environmental injustice. And then finally, I think it's really important that we use our relative positions of privilege and power as university researchers and so on to serve as a kind of bridge between communities and local institutions or to other communities that we might be connected to. And now, as one final piece, I want to sort of broaden the scope of this research, kind of leave us with maybe an open question and some thoughts for future research and action. And so I want to point out that the parties responsible for this contamination in Southside Tucson are predominantly the U.S. Armed Forces and Raytheon, who's the second biggest military defense contractor operating in the United States. So in this way, the struggle for environmental justice in Southside Tucson is intimately connected with the struggle for justice in Palestine. Just as Raytheon, for instance, has poisoned the groundwater in Tucson at the expense of the poor people of color living in proximity to these facilities, so too have they contributed to the acute and the slow violence that's wrought on the Palestinian people by the Israeli government. We know that many of the tens of thousands of tons of bombs that have been dropped in Gaza in the past 3 months were designed and produced in Raytheon here in Tucson. And so I think and I hope that by acknowledging these kind of broader contexts, we as critical environmental psychologists, we can identify and critique and combat these kind of webs of coloniality and racial capitalism that connect all struggles for justice. So with that, I will end there and say thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to some discussion.